Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to this policy briefing organized by the European Policy Center with Maciej Popowski, Acting Director General in the DG NEAR at the European Commission. Welcome, sir, and many thanks for accepting our invitation to speak here today about the Commission's opinion and more general position on the EU membership bids of Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova, both of which are now officially candidate countries, as well as Georgia, which has received the European perspective. I'm eager to start our conversation, but before we do so, a few housekeeping rules for our participants. For those in the audience who wish to send us written interventions, please note that the questions and answers box on your screens is available throughout the meeting, so you are free to use it whenever you want. I will do my best to wave your contributions into our discussion as we go. Conversely, if you'd rather intervene live, then please raise your hand by clicking on the appropriate icon on your screen, and then please wait for me to give you the floor when the time comes. Okay, with that, let's get started. Mr. Popowski, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was very prompt to declare quite early on after the start of the war that Ukraine belongs to the EU and that the bloc wants it to become a member. As early as April this year, during her first visit to Kiev since the beginning of the war, she handed to the Ukrainian President Zelensky the questionnaire, the famous questionnaire that symbolically marks the start of the enlargement procedure. Why was it so important, and why is it important for the Commission to take this decisive position so fast vis-à-vis Ukraine and the other two Eastern countries?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. Thank you for this opportunity. The President recognized clearly the momentum that was there, and what has happened since April, and what happened in June was truly historic. There is no exaggeration about that. That we offered European perspective to three countries, something that was very difficult to imagine half a year ago, and then two of them became candidate countries. Everybody is impressed that things have happened so quickly, but what is important to underline, and we do it all the time, is that we've done everything by the book. We applied exactly the same rules to the three applicants as we did in the past to the countries in the Western Balkans or to Turkey. So this the visit was very significant. The one in April. There was another one in June, by the way. The Ukrainian government has replied to our question in record time, to the first part of the questionnaire within a week, but the replies we got were of very high quality and convincing enough for us to do our work properly. And I'm proud to say that the opinions, the findings of the opinion, the three opinions and the recommendations were all rock solid. And the reception in the Council was, from our point of view, overwhelming. And the President really had this sense of fulfillment when she was in the European Council, because everybody said, we've done it the right way. That's the recommendation we are glad to follow, because everything is solid, convincing. We build a good case. So that was the spirit. Of course, it's not over; it's just the beginning of the road. And the President also invested a lot, reaching out to the EU leaders to explain to them what exactly we had in mind, how we want to go about it, what kind of steps, we call them steps, we expect the countries to take. We can go into that in the course of the discussion. so that we could conclude conclude this first part of the process in June. And I would say that there are many side effects of the war on the Russian aggression, many side effects that Putin did not foresee, like, I don't know, consolidation of of the Ukrainian statehood, or the consolidation of NATO, and one of them is also the reinvigoration of the enlargement policy, because it's back with a vengeance, is on the minds and the agenda of the European leaders, and we also see the clear value of the European of the enlargement policy as our own investment in Europe's security, prosperity, and stability.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, sir. Now, we have done it the right way, you said, but do you think that this gesture of offering this huge symbolic gesture of offering candidate status to Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova could be interpreted by Russia as a provocation? What do you think could be the geopolitical implications of including the associated trio into the enlargement process?
Knowing Russians, they can define everything as a provocation, but so far the reactions were rather muted, low key, since the decision that was taken, and we have always said very clearly that it's the choice on each and every country. I mean, they decide about their future and which organization they want to belong to, and it's their choice. And not anybody else's. And by the way, I mean, we acted very quickly, but we assessed progress that these countries have made over a number of years, not since the beginning of the war. Mm-hmm. When you look back at the developments in Ukraine, a lot of changes have happened since 2014, actually. And of course the time, I mean, the changes in Georgia started before. Now there was some backsliding. That's why we put forward different recommendations for Georgia than for the other two, etc., etc. But we've assessed progress made over a number of years in the countries that are bound with us through the association agreements and deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. And that was also a basis of our evaluation, not only the questionnaires, that was key, of course, but this whole body of experience since 2014, 2016. I mean, those three association agreements entered into force in 2016. So it's been 6 years.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. And what about the Balkans? Do you think that there is a risk that this step will maybe signal to the Balkan countries that maybe conflict is the best way to get the attention of the EU and get things moving?
No, that would be a mental shortcut. And of course, the first reactions that were a bit emotional in the beginning, when the three countries filed their applications, were exactly of that kind, saying, you know, do you expect the Russians to start bombing us so that something will move? But actually, we saw this momentum as an opportunity, as an important opening, an opportunity to speed up and reinvigorate the enlargement process as a whole. And we made it very clear, and the European Council, the leaders spent quite some time discussing the Balkans 2 weeks ago. So we made it very clear that we really want to move forward. In particular, we are repeating ourselves, but for a good cause. We really want to move ahead and start accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania as soon as we can, and actually now. because we came to this conclusion already a couple of years ago, and it was impossible. We are still sorting out a number of important issues, but we really hope that it would be the case. And now there's a lot of attention among the European leaders. Nobody wants to leave the Western Balkan countries behind. So I think the message was very clear to them.
Yes, and then you mentioned these steps that you're expecting the trio to take, the different countries in the trio to take. Maybe it's the right moment to go into the details of the avis that the Commission has drafted in each case, and maybe you can tell us a bit how the three countries compare one with the other.
Yes, indeed. So when you look at the steps, there are differences. So it's not one size fits all, because we evaluate individual progress instead of play. So when you read the the opinion on Ukraine, we put a lot of emphasis on the resilience of the institutions and the state. Actually, it was a little miracle of this whole sad situation of the war that the Ukrainian state and public institutions in general have performed so well. And the decentralization has been a success story, because we see how reliable and solid the local communities are, the hramadas, the regional governments, and then the municipalities, majors who have become local heroes. So the institutions are really solid. Of course, a lot remains to be done. Now, the differences are, and there are several differences, but when you look at the specific steps for Ukraine, some of them are very punctual, like, for instance, the appointment of the special prosecutor for corruption cases, the so-called SAPO. A special anti-corruption prosecutor's office, or the wrapping up of the selection of judges of the Constitutional Court. This is something that can be done relatively quickly. In the case of Moldova and Georgia, many of those steps are more systemic, so that it will take some time to proceed and to achieve good results. When you see, for instance, that Moldova should address shortcomings identified by the OSCE, ODIHR, or the Council of Europe and the Venice Commission, the election process, for instance, or dealing with the influence of oligarchs. And so the Georgian, in the Georgian opinion, it's the same. I mean, we really would like to see progress in the fight against corruption and organized crime, for instance, which was not underlined for the other two. So some problems, some issues are very specific. Some are more systemic, some are more punctual. But what we need is a good track record. I mean, as President von der Leyen put it in her during her latest visit in Kiev in early June, she said publicly that the institutions are in place. Now we need results, because with good results, we'll be able to convince member states that the countries are on track, and they will be able to assume the obligations of membership. And of course, it will take some time. We got a tasking from the European Council to report on progress as part of our regular enlargement report. And this is also important to underline, that we will not treat these countries differently from the Balkans and Turkey. So we'll integrate the reporting into our annual reporting cycle, and use exactly the same criteria, the same methodology to assess progress and to see how they're doing. At some point, of course, and that was underlined in the conclusions of the European Council, the EU will also have to reflect on its own capacity to absorb new members. That was very much on the mind of many leaders, and this is perfectly normal. I mean, it has always been the case. The criteria don't change. The Copenhagen criteria were defined in 1993 and still hold. So this is the benchmark we'll continue to use.
Yes. Of course, some of these countries, like you said, might have punctual steps to take, others more fundamental structural reforms. But of course, the war is still ongoing, and the end of the war is not yet in sight. If this turns into a protracted war or a frozen conflict, how can the accession process with these Eastern countries advance in practical terms? Can we actually expect any of them to meet these conditions, or the steps, as you call them, that have been set, given the situation that they're facing and are likely to face?
It's not going to be easy for sure. But again, when we look at the performance of the Ukrainian state, it's actually impressive. So everything has been functioning normally. I mean, they are under enormous pressure, and they are faced with a very difficult economic situation where the economy is about to shrink by 3/4. I mean, 75%. It is, nobody knows exactly, but it may happen because they lose a lot of revenue. Not least because of the Russian blockade of Black Sea and Azov Sea ports. But on the other hand, you see the government working in full swing, Rada, so the parliament in session, municipalities delivering all the necessary services to the citizens. Actually, more and more Ukrainian refugees coming back to the country, and the reconstruction is also starting now in the parts of the country that are less affected by the war. Well, all countries affected by the war, but there's less, I mean, fighting continues in the east and in the south. And actually the government of Ukraine, they have their own vision and even a sort of a classification of different regions where reconstruction could proceed almost immediately. So they want to focus on basic infrastructure, whether it's roads and railways, schools and hospitals, so that life can go back to normal. So I don't want to speculate about the end of the war. The impact will be enormous. For the time being, we are working hand in hand with other donors and allies and friends of Ukraine to keep the government afloat, to make sure that they have enough liquidity, enough money to continue the delivery of the services. So it's challenging, but not impossible. But you know, if reforms happen, if things change on the ground, then we'll be able to assess it and come up with a solid assessment, with a solid judgment on the state of play. And the same is true for Moldova and Georgia. And Moldova is affected by the war, not directly, but of course it feels the pressure a lot, not least because of the presence of Ukrainian refugees and the economic repercussions. Georgia is not affected directly, although Georgia was a victim of the Russian aggression in 2008, and it's still and parts of the country are still under Russian occupation. But it doesn't mean that reforms cannot happen. On the contrary, I think the country are really motivated to make progress.
Because you mentioned the Republic of Moldova and the parts occupied. How do you think that the transmission issue factors into the steps that Moldova needs to take as part of the Commission's opinion?
Look, of course, we mentioned it in the opinion, but it's, I mean, it's not a step or a condition in its own right. Of course, it has an impact. It's not, the situation is not new, unfortunately. I mean, it's been going on for what, 27 years now or more. So of course, we've always supported all international efforts to find a settlement for the Transnistria conflict. But again, we are now focusing on our engagement with the Moldovan authorities. So the president and the government and their own reform agenda that is clearly linked to Moldova's European path, now confirmed by the EU leaders.
Mm-hmm. Now, when I listen to you and when we read the opinions, of course, there's reference to things like, political criteria, track record of reforms, fight against corruption and organized crime, and so on and so forth. Issues that, of course, sound very familiar with the kind of challenges and problems that we're also confronted with in the EU's enlargement towards the Balkan countries. And you said that the trio will be treated as the Balkans. So does this mean that the new enlargement methodology will apply now to the Eastern countries as well?
Yes, it will.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are not going to rewrite it. I mean, it's relatively new. I mean, the enlargement methodology was presented to the Council and approved in 2020. Mm-hmm. So we've been using it since then, and then that's the same. Will be exactly the same. So as I said, we will integrate those countries into our reporting cycle as of next year. So we still need to work with them a lot just to explain how it works. I mean, it requires a lot of efforts. It requires a lot of expertise on their side. But okay, we'll have time to do that, and the timelines are clear. But once again, we'll use exactly the same set of rules for all the candidate countries and potential candidate countries.
Mm-hmm. And because you said that the plan is not to rewrite the new methodology, what comes to mind is Charles Michel's proposal on the geopolitical community, which also refers to enlargement and calls for phasing in of rewards, which to me at least sounds very similar to what the new approach foresees as well, that the carrot is divided into pieces that are given on the way as countries advance, as opposed to only at the very end. So how do you read these proposals that have emerged more recently? Are they meaning to rewrite the new methodology, or how do you see them?
No, first of all, there is no contradiction between the proposal for European political community and now the Czech presidency is working with the French, the previous presidency, on a concept note, and they are planning for a first inaugural meeting at the leaders level in Prague in early October. But President Macron has been very clear himself, saying that there is no contradiction between enlargement policy and the broader framework. That is relatively light, doesn't require any particular legal basis, and will bring together different European countries to engage on different matters, whether it's economy, security, and energy, etc., etc. We'll see how it works. I mean, we don't know the details yet, but this idea of providing incentives or intermediate steps is also well captured in our enlargement methodology, where we speak about the possibility of early integration, meaning these countries are already quite well advanced. They take part in a number of EU programs, Erasmus, Horizon, and many others. They have their association agreements and trade agreements, meaning the level of trade integration is pretty high. We also involve them in different cooperation schemes. Take the latest example that is also linked to the ongoing war, the idea of involving the Balkans and the 3 countries in the east, so the trio, in this joint purchasing platform for gas. So it's a new tool, and we offered to them that they will be part of it from the outset.
Mm-hmm.
We did it a little bit during COVID, mainly for the Balkans, where the green lanes were extended to the Balkans. They were also co-opted, so to speak, into the joint purchasing mechanism for protective equipment, etc., etc. So that's the logic, and we will be working on that. I mean, that will take some time. We'll have to look at different options. We'll see which cooperation schemes we can extend and when. But that's it is an incentive, and it's also a way of familiarizing them with us, but also vice versa. For ourselves, the institutions, the member states, to get used to the candidates and future members.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the new methodology is still valid. There's no contradiction with the proposals for a geopolitical community. But then, do you think that it is nevertheless necessary to rethink EU's engagement with neighbors and allies, and particularly the enlargement process, so that to prevent it, for example, getting hijacked by member states, or to prevent that countries remain in limbo for so many years, like it's been the case over the past decades? Is there the need to nevertheless reflect on how else we can improve the enlargement process, even if the enlargement methodology remains valid?
One of the foundations of the methodology is the political steer by the member states. So if we manage to keep it high on the political agenda, it should help. It's not always easy because different issues come up, and member states may have different views. But it's important that we don't treat it as business as usual, that it's again a highly political process with this geopolitical dimension, that we are now sort of extending the European space of stability and cooperation to other members. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the heydays of enlargement of the early 2000s. I mean, at that time I was on the receiving end as a Polish diplomat. So, and this was a top policy. And I think now, because it has become, as we sometimes call it, Chefsache, so it's really for the leaders to deal with. It's actually an advantage that we can use that energy, that political energy, to make quicker progress, hopefully, for all countries. Of course, they still need to deliver. That's why, for instance, the leaders also spent quite some time 2 weeks ago discussing the situation of Bosnia and the steps that could be taken in order for Bosnia to become a candidate country.
Yes, whether they deliver. But what if they deliver and in the end, for example, Romania starts blocking the Republic of Moldova on grounds that Moldova is in fact a region in Romania? I mean, those kind of risks remain present.
Well, I could turn the question back to you, but I mean, so far it has never been signaled as an issue. I know that there is a province that is called exactly the same. It has been an issue in the relationship between North Macedonia and some of its members. It doesn't have to become an issue for any other candidate countries, hopefully not. So we always try to appeal to all the countries concerned to sort out the differences in an amicable way. And so I don't actually see any particular issue with Moldova's application, and Romania has always been a staunch supporter of Moldova, and will host a high-level conference on Moldova in next week, actually, and to discuss the support and the ways of making progress.
Yeah, no, I mean, I took it as a silly example, which I hope remains just an example of given the history that member states have and that the issues that we're still facing regarding bilateral issues in the Balkans. Now, you mentioned absorption capacity, and of course, we know that enlargement is transformative, not only for the countries themselves, but also for the EU. Do you think that the EU has any appetite or is willing to assume this transformation and any potential major changes to the treaties that this would entail?
For the time being, as we see, the member states have diverging views on that. One hand, the parliament, for instance, is calling for a new convention. A number of member states have clearly stated they are not willing to engage in any discussion on treaty changes. Let's see where it leads us. I mean, this is a highly political process. But even from a purely mechanical point of view, some adaptation will be needed at some point when we will, in the future, will be preparing accession treaties. Accession treaties produce treaty changes because they are being added to the European Union's primary law. And of course, it's way too early to discuss details. This is always done at the very end of the process. But that's why the leaders already marked their interest, or I mean, I wouldn't call it a concern, but they underlined the need to discuss absorption capacity and the impact of enlargement on the European Union as a whole.
Okay, well, we are collecting quite a few comments and questions from our audience, and I see that there is one hand that is up as well. So I'm going to bring in our audience at this point, and there are, as far as I can see, they're quite long questions. It would be great if you can keep your questions short because it's very difficult to read this much text. But it seems that at least 3 of the questions are about Georgia. One is more of a comment that by all objective indicators, Georgia was more qualified to receive the candidate status than either of the 2 countries, and yet it didn't. So maybe your comment on that, Mr. Popowski. Another question, why does Georgia have more chance than Bosnia? And finally, regarding Georgia, is the European Union a geographical union, or is it a group of ideas, such as human rights, rule of law? Because in geographical terms, membership of Georgia seems irrelevant. So I coupled the Georgian questions, and if you care to respond to these comments and questions, Mr. Popowski.
Sure. Look, again, the opinion on Georgia is very objective. So we, for instance, clearly acknowledged the relative strength of the Georgian economy and the economic system of the country. On the other hand, there was a lot of backsliding when we compare the current situation to the time when Georgia was clearly a champion of reforms within the Eastern Partnership, in the Eastern Partnership. But when we look at the functioning of the judiciary, the issue of political polarization was actually the first step, or the first priority that needs to be addressed. It is quite worrying, and that's why we thought, and the leaders agree, that that Georgia should first address those priorities before it can be granted candidate status. It's not impossible. It really depends on the commitment and the willingness of the Georgian government to address those priorities. They are pretty clear. So, you know, it's not an exclusion. It's not an exclusion. It's a reflection of reality. The question of geographical scope, look, it's all a bit relative, but Georgia itself has never hidden its European aspirations. It defines itself as a European country. So, and that's for me, and that still falls within the scope of our famous Article 49 that we invoked at the very beginning of our opinion. So, so that's as simple as that. Now I forgot the question in the middle.
Whether it's more warranted than Bosnia to receive.
Look, it's. I think it's a false contradiction. So Bosnia is actually further ahead than the 3 applicants or 2 new candidates and a potential candidate, because we all know the famous 14 key priorities for Bosnia. If Bosnia were to fulfill them within the next couple of months, they could actually start accession negotiations. That's the difference. We are not talking about that yet with regard to Ukraine or Moldova and Georgia. So actually they are, I mean, I would say better off, but they are more advanced. So the list of priorities is very clear. So if they deliver, and the discussion among the leaders was about the critical mass, how we can define a critical mass of reforms that would enable the European Council to grant candidate status to Bosnia. So we need to come back to the leaders and report on the state of play. That was also a task given to us. But let's assume they fulfilled all of them. Then the next step is opening of the accession negotiations.
Okay. I will couple 2 other questions sent in written, and then I'm going to invite the raised hands. The 2 questions that I'm thinking to take together refer to the EU's absorption capacity. One of the questions is asking whether we could have relevant indicators on the EU's absorption capacity, and whether there is a process in place to define such indicators. And then another question is asking whether a staged accession approach would be feasible and useful for the 3 Eastern countries. How do you assess the EU member states and institutions' capacity to adopt such an approach for future accessions, including temporary derogations of the veto right in the Council and post-accession monitoring of the rule of law reforms?
So I just switched off my microphone because my office is sometimes very noisy and there are ambulances passing by all the time. Look, we don't have any formal indicators, but we know where the difficulties lie. I mean, and many European leaders speak about it quite openly. I mean, for instance, the use of the unanimity rule in the Council in many policy areas too. So that's and that's we know how difficult those discussions are and how limited progress was so far. So I don't want to speculate about that. Some, as I mentioned before, some of the impact on the institutions will be, let's say, more mechanical. And I'm talking about the number of members of the European Parliament, the size of the European Commission as well. But again, this is for a future reflection. I know the concept of stage accession. I mean, I'm following all those debates, including led by EPC on the on different models of integration. And I found them very interesting because we also need sources of inspiration for our future thinking. So there was this proposal by the Brussels CEPS and the Belgrade-based EPC that we also discussed with you the other day in May. I think it was.
It was Milena's question, in fact.
It was exactly. So this is very. I mean, it's an interesting concept that is partly being implemented, for instance, when a candidate country completes accession negotiations it should normally become an observer in the Council and the European Parliament. And it may take a while. So we tried it. I mean, I was an observer in the Political and Security Committee for a year for Poland. So then you don't have a right to vote, but of course you are fully involved in the decision shaping, which is a very useful exercise for the whole administration back home, and for not only for the individuals like myself and many others, but for the administration to adjust. I could well imagine extending that period a little bit. I mean, that would require some formal decisions, I guess, but it's not impossible. But it's just a thought. I mean, we are not making any specific plans for that. But even this incremental extension of involvement of the candidate countries from the Balkans and from Eastern Europe to participate in different committees, for instance. This is at more technical level, but again, it's a very good familiarization exercise. People learn a lot and prepare, so it pays off at some point. This is certainly something that needs to be thought through. We don't have a blueprint yet. As I said, I'm following all those the discussions going on. I mean, there are also other models floating around. EEA Plus, now there is this latest proposal for the Partnership for Accession, I think it's called, coming from ECFR. The logic is similar, and the details are different, but the logic of early integration is there, which also mirrors our own approach as defined in the enlargement methodology. Mm-hmm.
Which is yet to be fully put in practice and tested in its full potential. And we hope it will happen very soon. I would now like to bring in Tamara and Marta and give them the floor. I see that their hands are up. Tamara, do you want to go first?
Yes. Hi.
Hello, we can hear you. Go ahead.
My name is Tamara Mitsubidze. I'm from Georgian TV company Rustavi 2, and I think I will have more technical questions if it's possible to answer. So about the procedures regarding Georgia. We know that we have 12 priorities to be fulfilled until the end of December. So how Commission will be monitor this situation, this fulfillment of these commitments? Can we expect some interim report between or in the middle of this process? And in case by the end of the year, by the end of December, we will fulfill all commitments. Do we need council meeting to grant for Georgia a candidate status, or as Mr. Borrell told me, it will be automatically? And what does it mean automatically? And last question, is IPA program now works regarding Georgia, or it's only working regarding candidate status countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Marta, do you want to go?
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Marta Muchnik. I'm a policy analyst with the European Policy Center. You've actually already touched upon this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit, if in your opinion, the war is propelling a fast-track approach to the association trio. And when I mean propelling a fast-track approach, I don't mean necessarily shortcuts or changing the methodology to the association trio as opposed to other aspiring members, but I speak about more the political will to enable granting that has enabled granting candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova. Do you think this political will that enabled this decision can be sustained over time, especially in a context when hopefully the war will be over? This is one question. I also have another question, if I may.
If it's a short one, Marta.
Yes. How much do you think the energy crisis will affect the forward movement for these countries, especially as these countries are highly dependent on Russian oil and gas? So yeah, these are my
Thank you, Marta. Thank you very much. and if I can abuse your kindness, Mr. Popowski, I will also, since the first question is rather technical about Georgia, I will add another question from our audience also about Georgia, asking, is political polarization really less in Moldova than Georgia? So one of our participants is asking that, or if you can address it when you're answering the first question on Georgia.
All right, so let me start with that one. We see in Moldova, we see a president and a government, the majority in the parliament, with a very clearly defined European agenda, and willing to reform the country. And it's not the same in Georgia. And there, because of this polarization, many institutions are completely paralyzed. And that is a source of concern, because we need functioning institutions to make any progress in any policy area. And that was our reading of the situation, which brings me to the monitoring. I mean, we will monitor the situation as we usually do. So we work through our delegations on the ground, present, including in Kiev, because the delegation returned to Kiev actually already in April, and now we have more and more presence on the ground. The delegations in Moldova and in Chisinau and Tbilisi are of course fully functioning. We'll be also using all other sources of intelligence that we normally use for enlargement reports. It's quite an elaborate process. I mean, I don't want to bother you with details, but whenever we start this reporting cycle, and it happens every year, sometimes in February, we send requests for input to the governments, to member states embassies, or to member states ministries, but to many other partners like the World Bank, OSCE, different UN agencies, Venice Commission, Council of Europe, etc., etc. So they all give us their own input, and then we analyze, we consolidate, and come up with our own assessment. So that will be done exactly the same way. So we were tasked by the European Council to report as part of our regular enlargement reports, and we'll do that. So regular enlargement package, that's the exact wording. So we'll not do this this year, because the enlargement package is now tentatively scheduled for adoption in October. That's too early. Whether or not we are going to report, present any kind of interim findings, well, that depends. If there is interest in the council, it may happen, but I don't want to prejudge that. We have a very clear tasking from our leaders, and there will be no shortage of sources for our assessment. But then, as for the decision to grant candidate status has to be taken by the council. Whether it will be done, I don't know, in the written procedure, whether it will be done at the level of the European Council, most likely yes. Whether you need a special meeting for that, I don't know. May not be necessary, but the European Council meets actually quite often, so that's not that difficult to handle. But that's the normal procedure, and I'm sure that the member states also want to take time to have their own view on the matter. The question on EPA, I've heard it before. There is no automaticity. So when you read the EPA regulation, and I'm sure everybody has read the EPA regulation, but there is an annex that also lists the beneficiaries. So if we were to change that, it would require a change to the regulation, which is quite a time-consuming process because it's a legislative act. But for the time being, there is no need for that because these countries are covered by the other instrument and the ICI Global Europe. So we can also use that sources of funding to work on the reforms that are necessary, provide them with support that is necessary within the framework of the accession process, and then we'll see whether there is any need to introduce changes to the EPA regulation. On the fast track and the political wheel, I mean, you partly answer your question yourself, saying that indeed fast track doesn't mean shortcuts. So I don't think that the next steps will be necessarily as quick as those that followed the application, because everything was happening so quickly. We were all impressed. There was this momentum. But of course, now the implementation phase is by definition a bit more complex. And I simply hope that there will be enough political will to sustain the interest and the engagement into enlargement process. In particular, when the war stops. I mean, many processes were triggered by the war. We all hope it will be over soon. But then, you know, we engaged in a process that goes in a certain direction, and we need to sustain it. That's also the job of the European Commission, that we are the institution that is in charge of the enlargement policy. But the energy crisis, I'm afraid we are all affected. Of course, a country like Moldova is much more dependent on Russia than many others. That's why we want to involve them in our strive for diversification. I mentioned this idea of gas purchasing. I mean, it's not an idea; it already exists. The gas purchasing platform. The countries have been already offered alternative sources of delivery. So Romania has been delivering gas to Moldova, for instance. Since the beginning. I mean, actually, the gas crisis in Moldova started before the war. The Russians provoked it in October of last year, and then we reacted very quickly by offering additional financial assistance to Moldova to cope with that. So we are certainly keen to extend our own solutions to those countries, and a lot has happened already. Meaning, for instance, the integration of both Ukraine and Moldova into the European grid, electricity grid, which was a major systemic change. They moved away from the post-Soviet electricity grid that was still there, and were integrated into the European grid successfully in record time again.
Okay, a final round of questions. We have two questions that are basically on the same subject, so I will couple them. Will the EU take the lead in coordinating decentralized support for Ukraine's recovery? Different member states are proposing to support the reconstruction of certain Ukrainian cities, but there's no apparent logic behind who's going to do what, is asking one of our participants. And on this same subject, will the reconstruction efforts potentially play a role in speeding up enlargement? So that's on the reconstruction topic. And then a final question. One of our participants is asking, do you agree that in a forthcoming political community, strict rules or frameworks are needed for all participants, like in the EU itself? If it will be too loose, the project will be jeopardized from the beginning. So the will rules be needed to prevent a free lunch at any price? Is the final question from our audience today, Mr. Popowski.
All right, so let me start with the reconstruction. We presented our views at the end of May, and President von der Leyen spoke about it at the European Council, but also more recently on Monday morning at the Ukraine conference in Lugano in Switzerland, where we are ready to take the lead, or actually to co-lead the process of reconstruction with the Ukrainians, and to help set up a Ukraine reconstruction platform, a body for coordination of donors, because we need, indeed, everybody wants to help, and there's a lot of different initiatives popping up. World Bank, the IMF, the United States, and many other donors are now coming up with ideas, but we need indeed a bit of streamlining and overview. But the whole process has to be owned by the Ukrainians. So now at the Lugano conference, Prime Minister Shmyhal presented the first outline of the Ukrainian reconstruction plan for the future. We still need to work on the details, but we are ready to support that. And we also announced in our communication at the end of May that we would like to set up a specific facility within the EU budget, the Ukraine reconstruction facility, to fund different reconstruction projects. It will be a major effort. The scale of the Marshall Plan, many refer to that already. Again, the momentum is there, a lot of goodwill, but we need donor coordination, and of course we need significant sources of funding. But indeed, reconstruction is also an opportunity to speed up certain reforms, following the logic of building back better, and this is very much on the mind of the Ukrainian authorities, both the president and the government. They want to use that to proceed with green transition, with digitalization, although they are quite well advanced. For instance, in terms of e-governance, Ukraine is quite advanced, I have to say. That was also one of the findings of our opinion. This will certainly help when the reconstruction starts, and the reforms will then be accelerated. Indeed, the Ukrainians themselves would like different European countries and regions to engage with the Ukrainian regions and cities. Specifically, they outlined some proposals at the Lugano conference. We have to see how it works in practice, but indeed it should be all put within this broader framework of reconstruction plan, a reconstruction platform that provides for a mechanism of coordination and scrutiny as well. Now on the political community, look, I don't know the rules. I mean, they are being discussed now between the Czech presidency and France in particular. I guess we will see a concept note on the political community in the coming weeks, and then we'll see. I think the idea is to keep it relatively simple and not to introduce a very strict rule book, and not to create a body with heavy decision-making procedures. But again, I don't know the details. Details are still being discussed. So I'm looking forward to a presentation by the Czech presidency.
Thank you very much, sir. For the very last minute of our time together, I would like to ask you if you could have any wish, expectation, hope come true with regard to enlargement this year still, what would that be? If the enlargement genie could grant you one wish, what would that wish be until the end of this year?
My wish would be to have another wish so that I can have two. But no, actually, no. The immediate priority for us is certainly the opening of accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania, which has been long overdue. And yes, we also need it not only for the countries that fully deserve it and have done everything we expected them to do, but also to maintain this positive dynamic of the enlargement process.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can only hope that that will happen. Thank you very much, sir, for answering all our questions so patiently, and many thanks also to our participants for being so active and inquisitive. I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. I look forward to continuing this conversation and to seeing all of you again at our future events. Many thanks and good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.